If you get to the water and you don't know what lure to tie on, don't start in the tackle box and just start guessing. Start with the water. If you look at the conditions in front of you, this will help narrow down most of the lure choices pretty quickly. I think we as anglers make choosing a lure a lot harder than it really needs to be. We open up our tackle box and there's 50 different things in there, and we start wondering which one the fish want today, right? Many times without any logical reasoning, we're just kind of guessing. So I'm going to take you through how I decide. I'm looking at 5 factors when I choose a lure. I'm looking at the water clarity. I'm looking at what cover I have, where in the water column I think the fish probably are, whether I need to cover a lot of water or slow down, and then what is the wind doing? Once I answer those questions, I'm not looking at a tackle box full of lures anymore. I'm probably choosing between a couple, maybe 2 or 3. So here's how I narrow it down. I don't really ever start with what are they biting on. Sometimes you get that information and sometimes it's good, right? But unless somebody just told you what they're catching fish on, you probably don't know. And even then, depending on when they were catching them, their conditions may be completely different from yours. So instead, I start out with what lure lets me fish this water correctly? And that's a pretty easy question to answer because a lure, it's just a tool, right? Some lures, they let you fish deep, like a Texas rig. Some let you fish shallow, like a really shallow running crankbait. Some come through grass or wood very well, like a Texas rig once again. Or even a spinnerbait can come through that because of the way it's designed, right? Some let you cover a lot of water. Back to our spinnerbait and our chatterbait. Even our crankbait, right? And some let you slow down and pick an area apart. And for this, we might be talking about throwing a jig. We might be talking about throwing a Texas rig worm again. Maybe even a Ned rig. So I'm not trying to guess the perfect lure before I ever make a cast. I'm trying to narrow down which tools actually make sense for the water that I'm looking at in front of me. And the first thing I look at is color. And I start with color not because I think it's the most important part of the lure selection. I don't. I start there because it's one of the easiest decisions to make and narrow things down. So if I've got really clear water in front of me, I'm generally leaning towards something more natural. I'm looking at a watermelon worm, a green pumpkin worm, a natural looking paddle tail like that, or maybe a natural looking crankbait. So kind of natural patterns, right? Things don't necessarily have to scream for attention. And as the water gets more stained, I'm usually adding some contrasts. So maybe we're looking at white. Or we're looking at adding some chartreuse to it. Something like that. Something the fish can pick up a little easier. And if the water gets really dirty or I've got very low light, that's when I start looking at darker colors. That's when I'm looking at June bug, a black and blue jig, black and blue bladed jig, black with blue flakes, solid black. When the water gets really dirty or I've got low light, that darker color gives me a stronger silhouette. And that black and blue, it's a good example. So don't overthink this part. I'm not standing there trying to decide between 7 different shades of green pumpkin or watermelon. I'm just getting myself into the right general color family. Clear water, generally more natural. Stained water, a little more contrast and visibility. Your white, your chartreuse. Really dirty water or low light, a stronger silhouette makes sense. This is your black and blues. And that's about as far as I take it to start. So now I know the general color I'm looking for. The next thing I'm looking at is the cover I'm going to have to pull this lure through. And this is probably the biggest filter in the whole process. Look at what's in front of you. Do you have grass in front of you? Do you have wood in front of you? Do you have rock? Do you have brush? Do you have a laydown? Do you have docks? Do you have open water, matted vegetation? Do you have pads? Whatever it is. because I want a lure I can put there where I think the fish are. If I've got heavy grass or wood everywhere, I'm probably not going to start with something that's constantly getting hung up. Something like that just doesn't make sense. A Texas rigged worm starts making a lot of sense because I can rig it weedless. And depending on what you're doing or what it looks like, you might be able to go with a jig as well. A spinnerbait also can work in those situations. A spinnerbait, even though it has a wide open hook, it's pretty weedless, and that's due to this V shape on the front of it that kind of pulls through weeds, right? And cover matters with topwater too. If I've got fairly open water or scattered cover, I'm able to fish a walking bait, or, I'm able to fish a popper. But if that same area is covered with matted grass or pads, I'm probably not throwing that treble hook bait through it. Now I start thinking maybe a frog. May make a whole lot more sense. Same part of the water column, completely different lure because of the cover. That's why I don't want to pick the lure first. The cover may eliminate it before I even make a cast. So don't choose a lure that kind of forces you to fish around the place you actually think the fish are. If you're constantly afraid of throwing it into cover because you're going to hang up, you've probably chosen the wrong tool. Now, I know my general color, and I know the kind of lure I can actually fish through that cover. The next question is, what depth am I working with? And what are the fish telling me about where they're feeding? Now, looking at that water column, right? Do I need to be on the bottom? Maybe I need to be, somewhere in the middle. Do I need to be running something really fast and shallow? Do I need to be right on top of the water? If I think the fish are down near the bottom, I need something that I can actually get down there and stay down there, right? And that's where you think a jig, a Texas rig worm, maybe a Ned rig, maybe even a deep running crankbait, depending on, what I'm fishing. If I'm working shallow water, I've got a completely different group of choices, but I don't just look at the depth of water. I look at what the fish and the bait are doing as well. If I can walk up and see bait fish getting chased across the surface, fish blowing up on top, little flickers of bait getting pushed around, that's really good information, right? The fish may have already told me where they're actively feeding. They're feeding close to the surface. And that's where your top water, may really pay off. And if that water is open, maybe I'm using a walking bait, maybe I'm using a popper. If I've got the same surface activity in heavy grass or pads, that's where your frog comes in again. And that's where these decisions, they start all working together. So I'm not saying I want to throw topwater today. I'm saying the fish appear to be feeding towards the surface, and this particular topwater lets me fish that cover that's in front of me. That's a much better reason to tie something on. And if there's no surface activity, that doesn't mean a topwater wouldn't work. It just means the fish haven't given me that extra piece of information to make me lean in that direction. So now I'm back to figuring out where I think those fish are positioned and choosing something that can effectively stay in that part of the water column. You can have a great lure tied on, right? But if the fish are 10 feet down and your lure speeds the entire retrieve 2 feet under the surface, you're asking that lure to do the wrong job. So now I've narrowed down the color. The cover has eliminated some lure styles, and I've figured out what part of the water column I want to fish. Now I need to decide how I want to fish it. Do I need to cover water and find fish, or slow down and pick an area apart? Real quick, if this kind of practical fishing helps you, consider subscribing. I try to keep this stuff simple and take as much of the guessing out of fishing as I can. Now back to either searching or slowing down. This one depends a lot on how much I know about the water. If I've got a big area in front of me and I really don't know where the fish are, I normally want something that lets me fish efficiently. And that might be a spinnerbait, a chatterbait, maybe it's a crankbait. Maybe it's a big inline spinner. Maybe it's a jerkbait. It could even be topwater if the conditions we've already talked about make sense for it. Something I can work through a larger area without spending 10 minutes on every little piece of the water. Now, if you've already found a really good piece of cover, or there's maybe a nice little point there, a laydown, a dock, a little opening in the grass where I think fish should be sitting, I may go in the other direction. And that's where I might think, well, let's go with a Texas rigged worm. Maybe I'm looking at throwing a jig in there. Or, even a Ned rig. Something I can slow down and keep in that general small area. An easy way to think about this, if I'm searching, I want efficiency, right? I want to be able to cover a lot of area. If I'm targeting, I want control and want to get right down into that particular spot. And that doesn't mean you can't search with a worm, and it doesn't mean that you can't throw a spinnerbait at one piece of cover. We're just trying to make the best first decision with the information that we've gathered up through these decisions. And at this point, we've narrowed things down quite a bit, right? We know the color family based on the water clarity. We know the cover based on what we're seeing, and we know what we can pull through that cover. We know where in the water column we need to fish. And we know whether we want something that covers water or something that can slow down. There's one more thing I'll look at before the final choice, and that's wind. Wind is more of a final adjustment for me. It doesn't erase everything we figured out, but it can change the conditions enough to push me towards one lure over another lure, right? If it's dead calm, then I probably have more choices. But once that wind starts putting chop on the water, a couple of things tend to happen. The surface disturbance makes it harder for the fish to see everything as clearly, right? And if the wind has been blowing into more of a shallow part of the water, it'll stir up the bottom and make that water more stained than it was before. So now we're talking about flash and color. So now the visibility in the water, it may have reduced for a couple of different reasons. That's one reason I start thinking more about moving baits with flash or vibration or a little more presence in the water, right? So back to our chatterbait, back to our spinnerbait, our crankbait. And so the spinnerbait, that's something you can fish around cover because you can get it through a lot of things, once again, because of this triangular shaped front part of it. It's got flash, it's got vibration, and I'm giving the fish something they can locate pretty easily in water that's moving around and may not be as clear. And depending on the cover and depth that we've already figured out, a crankbait or a bladed jig could fill this similar type job. And wind blowing into the bank can also move bait and create an area that's worth spending some time around. But I don't want to turn this into windy equals spinnerbait. That's not really what I'm saying. Wind is just one more piece of information. We've already figured out the color, the cover, the depth, whether we need to search or slow down. Now we're asking whether the wind changes that final choice. If I've narrowed it down to 2 or 3 lures and I've got wind stirring up the water and reducing visibility, that may push me towards a bait with more movement, flash, and vibration. We're still not trying to predict exactly what the fish will bite. We're just making the best first choice we can from the conditions in front of us. All right, so let's kind of run through this as a scenario. Let's say that we walk up to a pond and the water is stained. So right away, I'm probably thinking about something with a little more visibility or contrast, some of that white chartreuse. I've got scattered grass and a few pieces of wood. So whatever I choose to come through that, it needs to be able to do it reasonably well. The water is fairly shallow, and I'm not seeing anything that tells me the fish are feeding on top. I don't know exactly where the fish are, so I want to cover some water, and I've got wind blowing into the bank. Now we've got all 5 pieces of information. Stained water, scattered cover, it's shallow, I need to search, and there's some wind. For me, I'm picking up a spinnerbait for that. Maybe a white and chartreuse, maybe a chartreuse. It checks every one of those boxes. That doesn't mean I'm saying the fish are definitely eating a spinnerbait. I don't know that yet. I'm saying that a spinnerbait allows me to fish those conditions effectively. And that's a completely different thing. And if I walk up to the same pond and suddenly bait is getting blown up all over the surface, That gives me another piece of information. Now I'm seriously considering topwater. If it's fairly open, maybe that's a walking bait. If that activity is taking place around thick vegetation and pads, then I'm looking at a frog. Change the conditions and the tool changes with them. That's the whole point. You don't need the perfect lure. And this is probably the most important part of this whole thing, right? You're probably not going to know the perfect lure before you make your first cast. And I don't think you need to. There may be 3 or 4 lures in your tackle box that are all perfectly reasonable for the conditions you're fishing. And that's okay. The goal isn't somehow to predict exactly what the fish are going to eat before you start. The goal is to stop making random choices. So look at the water clarity. What general color family makes sense? Look at the cover. What can I actually pull through that cover? Look at the depth and the activity. Where in the water column do I need to fish? Am I seeing anything happening on the surface, right? Do I need to cover water or slow down? Am I searching for fish, or do I have an idea where there's an area that I want to pick apart? And then think about the wind. Does the wind push me more towards an aggressive or moving option? Then choose the lure that does those jobs. That's really it. You don't need 50 lures to answer those questions, and you don't need to stand there staring into a tackle box trying to guess what to fish first and what do the fish want. Look at the water, then choose the tool. So next time you walk up to the lake, don't ask, what's the best lure? Ask, what lure lets me fish these conditions correctly? That'll usually narrow down the decision a whole lot faster. Hit subscribe if this kind of content resonates with you. All right, that's all for this one. We'll see you on the next one.